Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading from Galactic Cluster by James Blish. We will continue with the story Nor Iron Bars. Our hero, the inventor of a new space drive and therefore made the captain of the ship trying it out, Mr. Arp, has just gone exploring the surface of an electron because that's the kind of place a new experimental space drive will take you. He and the young lady named Celia have just returned to the ship and found it empty. There was nobody on board the Flyaway 2, nobody but themselves. The telepathic silence left no doubt in Arp's or Celia's mind, but they searched the huge vessel thoroughly to make sure. It was deserted. Captain, Celia cried. Her panic was coming back full force. What happened? Where could they have gone? There isn't any place. I know there isn't. I don't know. Calm down a minute, Celia, and let me think. He sat down on a stanchion and stared blindly at the hull for a moment. Breathing the thinning air was a labor in itself. He found himself wishing they had not shucked their suits. Finally, he got up and went back to the bridge with the girl clinging desperately to his elbow. Everything was in order. It was as if the whole ship had been deserted simultaneously in an instant. Osterreicher's pipe sat snugly in its clip on the chartboard, though it was empty of any trace of the self-oxygenating mixture Osterreicher's juniors had dubbed old gunpowder. The bowl was still hot. It can't have happened more than half an hour ago, he whispered, as if they all did a jump at once, like the one that put me into your stateroom. But where to? Suddenly it dawned on him. There was only one answer. Of course, they had gone nowhere. What is it? Celia cried. I can see what you're thinking, but it doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense in this universe, he said grimly. Celia, we're going to have to work fast before Osterreicher makes some stab in the dark that might be irrevocable. Luckily, everything's running as though the crew was still here to tend it, which in fact happens to be true. So maybe two of us will be enough to do what we have to do. But you're going to have to follow instructions fast, accurately, and without stopping for an instant to ask questions. What are you going to do? Shut down the field. No, don't protest. You haven't the faintest idea what that means, so you've no grounds for protest. Sit down at the board over there and watch my mind every instant. The moment I think of what you're to do next, do it. Understand? No, but you understand well enough. All right, let's go. Rapidly, he began to step down the nurse current going into the field generators, mentally directing Celia in the delicate job of holding the fusion sphere steady against the diminishing strain. Within a minute, he had the field down to just above threshold level. The servos functioned without a hitch, and so, not very much to his surprise, did those aspects of the task which were supposed to be manned at all times. All right, now I'm going to cut it entirely. There'll be a big backlash on your board. See that master meter right in front of you at the head of the board? The black knob marked back EMF is cued to it. When I pull this switch, the meter will kick over to some reading above the red line. At the same instant, you roll the knob down to exactly the same calibration. If you roll it back down too far, the Nernst will die and will have no power at all. If you don't go down far enough, the Nernst will detonate. You've got to catch it on the nose. Understand? I think so. Good, he said. He hoped it would be good. Normally, the roll off was handled wholly automatically, but by expanding the energy evenly into the dying field, they did not dare to chance that here. He could only pray that Celia's first try would be fast. Here we go. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Cut. Celia twisted the dial. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, pandemonium. Nurse crew chief, report. What are you doing? No orders were. Captain, Miss Gaspardi, where did you spring from? This was Osterreicher. He was standing right at Arp's elbow. Stars! Stars! Stauffer was shouting simultaneously. Hey, look! Stars! We're back! There was a confused noise of many people shouting in the belly of the flyaway, too. But in Arp's brain, there was blessed silence. The red foaming of raw thoughts by the hundreds was no more. His mind was his own again. Good for you, Celia, he said. It was a sort of prayer. We were in time. How did you do it, sir? Osterreicher was saying. We couldn't figure it out. We were following your exploration of the electron from here, and suddenly the whole planet just vanished. So did the whole system. We were floating in another atom entirely. We thought we'd lost you for good. Arp grinned weakly. Did you know that you'd left the ship behind you when you jumped? But impossible, sir. It was here all the time. Yes, that too. It was exercising its privilege of being in two places at the same time. As a body with negative mass, it had some of the properties of a Dirac hole. As such, it had to be echoed somewhere else in the universe by an electron, like a sink in a source in calculus. Did you wind up in one of the shells of the second atom? We did, Stauffer said. We couldn't move out of it either. That's why I killed the field, Arp explained. I couldn't know what you would do under the circumstances, but I was pretty sure that the ship would resume its normal mass when the field went down. A mass that size, of course, can't exist in the microcosm, so the ship had to snap back. And in the macrocosm, it isn't possible for a body to be in two places at the same time. So here we are, gentlemen, reunited. Very good, sir, Stauffer said, but the second officer's voice seemed to be a little deficient in hero worship. But where is here? Uh, excuse me, Mr. Stauffer, but don't you know? No, sir, Stauffer said. All I can tell you is that we're nowhere near home and nowhere near the Centauri stars either. We appear to be lost, sir. He glanced quickly at the bourbon gauges. Also, he added quietly, we're still losing air. The general alarm had alarmed nobody but the crew, who alone knew how rarely it was sounded. As for the bubble gangs, the passengers who knew what that meant mercifully kept their mouths shut. Perhaps Hammersmith had blustered them into silence. And the rest, reassured at seeing the stars again, were only amused at watching full grown, grim looking men stalking the corridors, blowing soap bubbles into the air. After a while, the bubble gang vanished. They were working between the hulls. Arp was baffled and restive. Look here, he said suddenly, this surgical emergency of Hoyle's, I'd forgotten about it, but it seems to have some bearing on this air situation. He's on his way, sir, Osterreicher said. I put a call on the bells for him as soon as, here he is now. Hoyle was a plump, smooth-faced man with a pursed mouth and an expression of perpetual reproof. He looked absurd in his naval whites. He was also 4 times a Haber Medal winner for advances in space medicine. It was a ruptured spleen, he said primly, a dead giveaway that we were losing oxygen. I was operating when I had the captain called, or I'd have been more explicit. Aha, Osterreicher said. Your patient's black, then. A young black woman, 18-year-old girl, and incidentally one of the most beautiful women I've seen in many, many years. What's her color got to do with it? Arp demanded, feeling somewhat petulant at Osterreicher's obvious instant comprehension of the situation. Everything, said Hoyle. Like many people of African extraction, she has sickle cell anemia, a hereditary condition in which some of the red blood cells take on a characteristic sickle shape. In Africa, it is pro-survival because sickle cell anemia people are not so susceptible to malaria as are people with normal erythrocytes, but it makes them less able to take air that's poor in oxygen. That was discovered back in the 1940s during the era of unpressurized high-altitude airplane flight. It's nothing that can't be dealt with by keeping sufficient oxygen in the ambient air, but how is she? Arp said. Dying, Hoyle said bluntly. What else? I've got her in a tent, but we can't keep that up forever. I need normal pressure in my recovery room, or if we can't do that, get her back to Earth fast. He saluted sloppily and left. Arp looked helplessly at Stauffer, who was taking spectra as fast as he could get them onto film, which was far from fast enough for Arp, then let alone the computer. The first attempt at orientation, Schmidt's spherical films of the apparent sky in the hope of identifying at least one constellation, however distorted, had come to nothing. Neither the computer nor any of the officers had been able to find a single meaningful relationship. Is it going to do us any good if we do find the sun? Osterreicher said. If we make another jump, aren't we going to face the same situation? Here's S. Doradus, Stauffer announced. That's a beginning, anyhow, but it sure as hell isn't in any position I can recognize. We're hoping to find the source of the leak, Arp reminded the first officer, but if we don't, I think I can calculate a fast jump in and out again. I hope we won't have to do it, though. It would involve shooting for a very heavy atom, heavy enough to be unstable. Looking for the sun, a booming, unpleasantly familiar voice broke in from the bulkhead. It was Hammersmith, of course. Dogging his footsteps was Dr. Hoyle, looking even more disapproving than ever. Look here, Mr. Hammersmith, Arp said. This is an emergency. You've got no business being on the bridge at all. You don't seem to be getting very far with the job, Hammersmith observed with a disparaging glance at Stauffer, and it's my life as much as anyone else's. It's high time I gave you a hand. We'll get along, Osterreicher said, his face red. Your stake in the matter is no greater than that of any other passengers. That's not quite true, Dr. Hoyle said, almost regretfully. The emergency is medically about half Mr. Hammersmith's. Nonsense, Arp said sharply. If there's any urgency beyond what affects us all, it affects your patient primarily. Yes, quite so, Dr. Hoyle said, spreading his hands. She is Mr. Hammersmith's fiancée. After a moment, Arp discovered that he was angry, not with Hammersmith, but with himself for being stunned by the announcement. There was nothing in the least unlikely about such an engagement, yet it had never entered his head even as a possibility. Evidently, his unconscious still had prejudices he had extirpated from his conscious mind 35 years ago. Why have you been keeping it a secret? He asked slowly. For Helen's protection, Hammersmith said with considerable bitterness. On Centaurus, we may get a chance at a reasonable degree of privacy and acceptance. But if I'd kept her with me on the ship, she'd have been stared at and whispered over for the entire trip. She preferred to stay below. An ensign came in, wearing a spacesuit minus the helmet, and saluted clumsily. After he got the spacesuit arm up, he just left it there, resting his arm inside it. He looked like a small doll some child had managed to stuff inside a larger one. Bubble team reporting, sir, he said. We're unable to find any leaks. You're out of your mind, Osterreicher said sharply. The pressure is still dropping. There's a hole somewhere you could put your head through. No, sir, the ensign said wearily. There are no such holes. The entire ship is leaking. The air is going right out through the metal. The rate of loss is perfectly even, no matter where you test it. Osmosis, Arp exclaimed. What do you mean, sir? Osterreicher said. I'm not sure, Mr. Osterreicher, but I've been wondering all along, I guess we all have, just how this whole business would affect the ship structurally. Evidently, it weakened the molecular bonds of everything on board, and now we have good structural titanium behaving like semi-permeable membrane. I'll bet it's specific for oxygen, furthermore. A 20% drop in pressure is just about what we're getting here. What about the effect on people? Osterreicher said. That's Dr. Hoyle's department, Harp said, but I rather doubt it affects living matter. That's in an opposite state of entropy. But when we get back, I want to have the ship measured. I bet it's several meters bigger in both length and girth than when it was built. If we get back, Osterreicher said, his brow dark. Is this going to put the kibosh on your drive? Stauffer asked gloomily. It's going to make interstellar flight pretty expensive, Harp admitted. It looks like we'll have to junk a ship after one round trip. Well, we effectively junked the flyaway one after one one-way trip, Osterreicher said reflectively. That's progress of a sort. Look here, all this jabber isn't getting us anywhere, Hammersmith said. Do you want me to bail you out or not? If not, I'd rather be with Helen than standing around listening to you. What do you propose to do? Arp said, finding it impossible not to be frosty, that we aren't doing already. Teach you your business, Hammersmith said. I presume you've established our distance from S. Doradus for a start. Once I have that, I can use the star as a beacon to collimate my next measurement. Then I want to use an image amplifier with a direct reading microvoltmeter tied into the circuit. You ought to have such a thing as a routine instrument. Stauffer pointed it out silently. Good. Hammersmith sat down and began to scan the stars with the amplifier. The meter silently reported the light output of each as minute pulses of electricity. Hammersmith watched it with furious intensity. At last, he took off his wrist chronometer and began to time the movement of the needle with the stopwatch. Bullseye, he said suddenly. The sun? Arp asked, unable to keep his tone from dripping with disbelief. No, that one is DQ Hercules, an old nova. It's microvariable. It varies about 4/100ths of a magnitude every 64 seconds. Now we have two stars to fill in our parameters. Maybe the computer could give us the sun from those? Let's try it anyhow. Stauffer tried it. The computer had decided to be obtuse today. It did, however, narrow the region of search to a small sector of the sky containing approximately 60 stars. Does the sun do something like that? Osterreicher said. I knew it was a variable star in the radio frequencies, but what about visible light? If we could mount an RF antenna big enough, we'd have the sun in a moment, Hammersmith said in a preoccupied voice. But with light, it's more complicated. If that's the sun, we must be even further away than I thought. Dr. Hoyle, will you take my watch, please, and take my pulse? Your pulse, Hoyle said, startled. Are you feeling ill? The air is. I'm fine. I've breathed thinner air than this and lived, Hammersmith said irritably. Just take my pulse for a starter, then take everyone else's here and give me the average. I'd use the whole shipload if I had time, but I don't. If none of you experts knows what I'm doing, I'm not going to waste time explaining it to you now. God damn it, there are lives involved, remember? His lips thinned. Arp nodded silently to Hoyle. He did not trust himself to speak. The physician shrugged his shoulders and began collecting pulse rates, starting with the big explorer. After a while, he had an average and passed it to Hammersmith on a slip of paper torn from his report book. Good, Hammersmith said. Mr. Stauffer, please feed these to the computer there, allow for a permitted range of variation of 2%, and bleed the figures out into 106 increments and decrements each. Then tell me what the percentage is now. Can do? Simple enough, Stauffer programmed the tape. The computer jammered out the answer almost before the second officer had stopped typing. Stauffer handed the strip of paper over to Hammersmith. Arp watched with reluctant fascination. He had no idea what Hammersmith was doing, but he was beginning to believe there was such a science as microastronomy after all. Thereafter, there was a long silence while Hammersmith scanned one star after another. At last, he sighed and said, There you are. This ninth magnitude job I'm lined up on now. That's the sun. Incidentally, we are a little closer to Alpha Centauri than we are from home, though God knows we're a long way from either. How can you be sure? Arp said. I'm not sure, but I'm as sure as I can be at this distance. Pick the one you want to go to, make the jump, and I'll explain afterwards. We can't afford to kill any more time with lectures. No, said Arp, I'll do no such thing. I'm not going to throw away what will probably be our only chance. The ship isn't likely to stand more than one more jump on a calculation I don't even know the rationale of. And what's the alternative? Hammersmith demanded, sneering slightly. Sit here and die of anoxia and just sheer damn stubbornness? I am the captain of this vessel, Arp said, flushing. We do not move until I get a satisfactory explanation of your pretensions. Do you understand me? That's my order. It's final. For a few moments, the two men glared at each other, stiff-necked as idols, each the god of his own pillbox universe. Hammersmith's eyelids drooped. All at once, he seemed too tired to care. You're wasting your time, he said. Surely it would be faster to check the spectrum. Excuse me, Captain, Stauffer said excitedly. I just did that, and I think that star is the sun. It's about 800 light years away. 800? Yes, sir, at least that. The spectral lines are about half missing, but all the ones that are definite enough to measure match nicely with the sun's. I'm not so sure about the star Mr. Hammersmith identifies as Alpha Centauri, but at the very least, it's a spectroscopic double, and it is about 50 light years closer. My God, Arp muttered. 800. Hammersmith looked up again, his expression curiously like that of a St. Bernard whose cask of brandy has been spurned. Isn't that sufficient? He said hoarsely. In God's name, get going. She's dying while we stand around nitpicking. No rationale, no jump, Arp said stonily. Osterreicher gave him a peculiar glance out of the corner of his eyes. That moment, Arp felt his painfully accumulated status with the first officer shatter like a Prince Rupert's drop, but he would not yield. Very well, Hammersmith said gently. It goes like this. The sun is a variable star. With a few exceptions, the pulses don't exceed the total average emission, the solar constant, by more than 2%. The overall period is 273 months. Inside that, there are at least 63 subordinate cycles. There's one at 212 days. Another one lasts only a fraction over 6.5 days. I forget the exact period, but it's 1,250th of the main cycle if you want to work it out on Bessie here. I guess something like that, Arp said, but what good does it do us? We have no tables for it. These cycles have effects, Hammersmith said. The 6.5 day cycle strongly influences the weather on Earth, for instance, and the 212-day cycle is reflected one for one in the human pulse rate. Oh ho, Osterreicher said. Now I see. It's Captain, this means we can never be lost, not so long as the sun is detectable at all, whether we can identify it or not. We're carrying the only beacon we need in our blood. Yes, Hammersmith said, that's how it goes. It's better to take an average of all the pulses available, since one man might be too excited to give you an accurate figure. I'm that overwrought myself. I wonder, is it patentable? No, a law of nature, I suppose. Besides, too easily infringed, almost like a patent on shaving. But it's true, Mr. Osterreicher. You may go as far afield as you please, but your son stays in your blood. You never really leave home. He lifted his head and looked at Arp with hooded, bloodshot eyes. How can we go, please? He said in a whisper. And Captain, if this delay has killed Helen, you will answer to me for it if I have to chase you to the smallest, most remote star that God ever made. Arp swallowed. Mr. Stauffer, he said, prepare for jump. Where to, sir? The second officer said. Back home or to destination? And there was the crux. After the next jump, the Flyaway 2 would not be spaceworthy anymore. If they used it up making Centaurus, they would be marooned. They would have made their one round trip a one-way one. Besides, your drive is more important than anything else on board, he had been told. Get the passengers where they want to go by all means if it's feasible. But if it isn't, the government wants that drive back. Understand? We're contracted with the passengers to go to Centaurus, Arp said, sitting down before the computer. That's where we'll go. Very good, sir, Osterreicher said. They were the finest 3 words Arp had ever heard in his life. The girl was exquisite even in her still and terrible coma. First off the ship into the big ship-to-shore ferry. Hammersmith went with her, his big face contorted with anguish. Then the massive job of evacuating everybody else. Everyone, passengers and the ship's complement alike, was wearing a mask now. After the jump through the heavy cosmic ray primary that Arp had picked, a stripped nucleus which happened to be going toward Centaurus anyhow, the Flyaway 2 was leaking air as though she were made of something not much better than surgical gauze. She was through. Osterreicher turned to Arp and held out his hand. A great achievement, sir, the first officer said. It'll be cut and dried into a routine after it's collimated, but they won't even know that back home until the radio word comes through better than 4 years from now. I'm glad I was along while it was still new. Thank you, Mr. Osterreicher. You won't miss the Mars run? They'll need interplanetary captains here too, sir. He paused. I'd better go help Mr. Stauffer with the Exodus. Right. Thank you, Mr. Osterreicher. Then he was alone. He meant to be the last off the ship. After living with Osterreicher and his staff for so long, he had come to see that traditions do not grow from nothing. After a while, however, the bulkhead lock swung heavily open and Dr. Hoyle came in. Skipper, you're bushed. Better knock it off. No, Arp said in a husky voice, not turning away from watching through the viewplate the flaming departure of the ferry for the green and brown planet, so wholly Earth-like except for the strange shapes of its continents, 1,000 miles below. Hoyle, what do you think? Has she still got a chance? I don't know. It will be nip and tuck. Maybe Wilson was ship's surgeon on the Flyaway 1. He'll pick her up as she lands. He's not young, not anymore, but he was as good as they came. And with a surgeon, it isn't age that matters, it's how frequently you operate. But she was on the way out for a long time. She may be a little. He stopped. Go on, give it to me straight. I know I was wrong. She was low on oxygen for a long time, Hoyle said without looking at Arp. It may be that she'll be a little simple-minded when she recovers. Or maybe not. There's no predicting these things. But one thing's for sure, she'll never dare go into space again, not even back to Earth. The next slight drop in oxygen will kill her. I even advise against airplanes for her. And Wilson concurs. Arp swallowed. Does Hammersmith know that? Yes, Hoyle said. He knows it, but he'll stick with her. He loves her. The ferry carrying the explorer and his fiancée, and Captain Willoughby's daughter and her Judy, and many others, was no longer visible. Sick at heart, Arp watched Centaurus 3 turn below him. That planet was the gateway to the stars for everyone but Darian and Helen Hammersmith. The door that had closed behind them when they boarded the ferry was for them no gateway to any place. It was only the door to a prison. But it was also, Arp realized, a prison which would hold a great teacher, not of the humanities, but of humanity. Arp, not so imprisoned, had no such thing to teach. It was true that he knew how to do a great thing, how to travel to the stars. It was true that he had taken Celia Gaspardi and the others where they had wanted to go. It was true that he was now a small sort of hero to his crew, and it was true that he, Dr. Gordon Arp, sometime laboratory recluse, sometimes fake spaceship captain, sometimes petty hero, had been kissed goodbye by a 3D star. But it was also over. From now on, he could do no more than sit back and watch others refine the ARP drive. The 4-year communication gap between Centaurus and home would shut him out of those experiments as though he were a Cro Magnon man or Darian Hammersmith. When next ARP saw an Earth physicist, he wouldn't have the slightest chance of understanding a word the man said. That was a prison, too, a prison Captain Gordon Arp had fashioned for himself and had then thrown away the key. Beg pardon, Captain? Oh, sorry, Dr. Hoyle. Didn't realize you were still there. Arp looked down for the last time on the green and brown planet and drew a long breath. I said, so be it. And we will continue with Mr. Blish's anthology next time.